round numbers, I think that we've been attending St. Paul's about 30 years. And this is the first Ascension Sunday that they've had a blowout musically like they did today. I mean, it was
Awesome.
fabulous. So if it is not in your customary schedule to go to the worship service, it's worth it just for that. So remember, no matter who you are, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. So the question that this talk is about today is, what do we mean when we talk about God? I just want to open the door today to this topic. Actually, I began this last Sunday. This topic is full of landmines. I could not write it without consistently using the word God, so forgive me for that. If there is no external theistic interventionist God in the sky, how do we even talk about what is God? So I'll be using that word God to refer to that which does not exist. At least God does not exist in the way that we think of a tree existing or a rock existing. And we began to get into this last week when I referred to the God is dead issue that came alive in the 60s. So bear with me today. This God topic is chaotic, which is just like the cosmos in which we live. It's chaotic. So what do we mean when we talk about God? This is a question that has been part of human consciousness since the dawn of human consciousness. We live in a world where things happen that we don't understand, that we can't control, and we want to know what's behind this. More importantly, we want to know how can we befriend it. So I'm going to repeat this question, and the questions related to it have preoccupied the human since the dawn of human consciousness. And we'll get deeper into it in the weeks ahead. So what do we mean when we use the word God? I'm sure when I say God, there's an image that pops up in your head that is very different from the image that pops up in my head. Probably no two people in this room think the same thing about God. There are people who have very strong, vivid, rigid religious beliefs who can tell you very little about God. From time to time, I'll have someone tell me in the strongest language possible, when they find out that I am a religious, they'll say, I don't believe in God. And I'll say, okay, tell me the God you don't believe in. Maybe I don't believe in that God too. And they have a very difficult time doing it. The word God, as far as I can tell, has a Germanic origin, and it's related to the word good. It's also related to a word that we get the word libation from, to pour out. To pour out, you can see that God would be thought of as that energy that dispenses things like floods and fires and winds and things over a period of time. I went for a long time trying to discipline myself not to use the word God at all, except where it was required in a religious liturgy. Devout Jews won't say the word. My preferred phrase for a long time was sacred mystery, but that's not satisfactory because from the perspective of non-dual mind, everything is sacred. So the moment you make a differentiation between sacred and not sacred, you've divided the field. And I don't know what your experience is, but the more I go along in my own life's journey, the more mysterious everything is. I mean, you know, I think, and I say this to you from time to time, most of us do not live with an awareness of how incredibly lucky we are. That we get to be here like this is just so amazing. Now, as you know, in my teaching, I stepped off the cliff of what we thought was sure and certain into the ambiguity that exists between what I'm calling the no longer and the not yet. And the major reaction to the passing away of things that we thought were sure and certain structures, and this is a global phenomenon, it's not just confined to the United States. The major reaction to this is fear. People get frightened. And by the way, this is not my notes, but every time in the Jewish and Christian writings where you have an epiphany, meaning there's an appearance of God, the presence of God shows up in some way, it is always, without exception, preceded or followed by the phrase, fear not. Be not afraid. So fear shows up in the religious arena and to some degree in political arenas as fundamentalism. And fundamentalism is a religion of certainty and control. With very few exceptions, Christian fundamentalism is showing up in what is called evangelical Christianity, and it has become a political movement. Not just in this country, but in many places in Europe, Africa, South Africa, Central America, and fundamentalism is dangerous and divisive. So before getting into the specifics of Christian fundamentalism, which we're going to be doing in a few weeks, I thought it might be helpful for us to have some conversations about God. Now you can go back in the archives that are on the Ordinary Life website and see the talks that I've offered since beginning this particular theme. And what I said is that there is no external theistic interventionist God off in the sky somewhere. Sometimes people think of God as kind of a celestial bellhop who comes to satisfy our needs when we ask. At other times, people think of God as a vengeful God. God sends hurricanes and earthquakes, floods, tornadoes, usually to punish people for their sins. And if that doesn't do the trick, God sends them to hell for all eternity. More people's image of God is probably shaped by hell than anything else. I'm going to spend a whole time talking about that. Not today, but coming up. And you might remember after starting this, I spent some time talking about prayer. The problem of prayer, the promise of prayer, the peril of prayer. If there's no external theistic God, to whom do we pray? You know, Michael Dowd is coming here in November, and he and I have been talking on the phone off and on about that. And he asked me during one of those conversations, what are you currently teaching in Ordinary Life? And I told him I was doing the series on prayer. And he said, ever since fully embracing an evidential evolutionary theology, my prayer life has just flourished. And I would agree with that. So whatever we mean when we use the word God is so much more accessible when you realize and accept and embrace that God is not out there. God's in here. Right? God's in here. God's in here. And that's much more accessible than out there. There's no place where God is not. So the title of this talk is A History of God. Next week we're going to be talking about questions that have come up in the interim since beginning this. And then I'm going to offer another talk on the evolution of God. Karen Armstrong wrote a book called A History of God, and you may think it odd to think that God has a history, and I certainly know that the idea of the evolution of God is shocking for many people. To think of God as evolving may verge on some kind of blasphemy. But needless to say, at least in my opinion, the history of God, the evolution of God are topics that are very, very important on a variety of many different levels. So, as I said, the goal of this talk today is to get you to think or to rethink the answer, your answer, not mine, but your answer to the question, what is the character of your God? Last week, we talked, among other things, about how reality doesn't change, but rather people's understanding of reality changes. This doesn't happen easily. If you remember, indeed, if you mess with some people's understanding of what's true, things can get messy pretty quickly. And I hope that doesn't happen in this talk today. This inquiry into the history of God has not in any way undermined or shaken my own faith. Quite the contrary. As I look back on it now, this has been an energizing journey for me. At least it's being that for me. And I think it began when I had my very first encounter with Ilia Delio. I would say that the personal nature and the intimate nature of my own relationship with the sacred has only deepened, and the horizons of my faith have only expanded. Now, you can take this talk today and print it out and give it to a fundamentalist, and I don't think it's going to change anything for them, because their categories are already set. You have to come into this with an open mind, not already a committed position. Fundamentalists are not what I think we must always remain, which is spiritual seekers who are committed to growth as the primary purpose of life and living. I've been tempted in giving these talks to revisit one or another of the useful models of spiritual growth. I've decided not to do that at this point, except to say that growth and development in the adult years is a topic that has broadly been ignored in our culture. And as someone who spends hours every week dealing with the consequences of childhood events and influences, I know how important that period of life is. I know the impact that childhood can have on later growth and behavior. What we now know is that those foundational events can be revisited, learned about, and dealt with in ways that contribute to ongoing growth and development in people significantly into what we call old age. We old people can change and grow. And it's exciting to learn new things. Now, whatever you think about God, it has undoubtedly been influenced more by the culture you have been influenced in most of your life than any other single thing. So last week, you remember, I gave you kind of my personal God history. You have your own. And my goal then was just to raise your awareness about what your God history is. I have a huge collection of God cartoons. While getting ready for this talk, I opened my huge collection of cartoons and found one I had never shown in here. It's a New Yorker cartoon claiming to portray the true story of creation. And it informs us that on the first day, God did nothing because, well, there was plenty of time. And on the second day, it's the same deal. Why rush? But on the third day, He created a list. But on the fourth day, he was just not in the right mood. And then on the fifth day, there was all this stuff going on you don't want to know. And then, according to this cartoonist, on the sixth day, God created the whole shebang. And there is everything literally up here that you can see. There's stars and pineapples and Saturn and stars and mountains. I don't see a duck-billed platypus. There's a snake and an octopus. The whole shebang. And then on the seventh day, God rested. I'm gonna fill the whole class time with this, but there are some that are too priceless to do. Two angels. When you get a chance, remember to ask God about the meaning of life. It's a riot. And then, and almost, one of Gary Larson, you remember Gary Larson? This is one of Gary Larson's best cartoons. God as a kid tries to make a chicken in his room. God gets a dinner invitation and says, sorry, I can't come, I have to be everywhere. And here's God reading at night. So the image that most people have of God is distant. God is remote. And even more damaging for spiritual growth and development, God is to be feared. My experience in talking to people over the years is, as I said, the notion of hell has shaped people's idea of God more than any other thing. The God of Jesus, whom he warmly spoke of as Daddy, which is one of the few Aramaic words, which is the language Jesus spoke, that we have from the lips of Jesus. This intimate, safe God is a God that most people haven't encountered. So we come hear somebody like me talk, or you hear Jim Finley talk about the ecstasy of the mystics, like the Cloud of Unknowing, or Julian of Norwich, or Teresa of Avila, and we think, wow, I've never had an experience like that. How do you get that? So people revise their views on all sorts of things they learned about in childhood, like Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, but they retain religious beliefs they got in the third grade about God. There's something wrong with this failure in religious and spiritual education. Now, when I'm talking about God today, I am speaking specifically about the God that is referred to in the Abrahamic traditions, the Jewish faith, the Islam faith, the Christian faith. This is the God that some of us refer to in the creed that we say in the worship service. I believe in God, the Creator, Father Almighty, Creator of heaven and earth. By the way, that's flat earth theology and it's nighttime language. And I'm going to devote a whole class to that sometime because so many people are asking me, how is it that you can give these classes in here and then go across and worship? I'm going to talk about that. That's something that we can talk about. The word God has no objective meaning. It means something only in context. And if you understand from last week, that context changes from generation to generation, or from one period where reality was understood one way to another period when reality was understood another way. So that when the meaning of God, when one conception of God has ceased to have meaning or relevance, it's discarded and it's replaced by another. Now, fundamentalists would deny this, of course. The assumption of fundamentalism is that Abraham, Moses, and the prophets who came after them experienced God all in the same way, which they didn't, and that we should too, which we can't. Yeah, if you look at the history of the three Abrahamic religions, it is clear that each religion's understanding and each era's understanding of God was different. And that's true for atheism too. The statement, I don't believe in God, has meant something slightly different in each period of history. The people who have either been called atheists or who have claimed that label for themselves have always denied a particular conception of God. I don't believe in that understanding of God. In her book, A History of God, Karen Armstrong, in talking about atheists, asked, is the God who is rejected by atheists today the God of the patriarchs, the God of the prophets, the God of the philosophers, the God of the mystics, or the God of the Enlightenment deists? All these deities have been venerated as God of the Bible and the Quran by Jews, Christians, and Muslims at various points in their history, and they are all very different from each other. There was a time when the early Christians were called atheists because they did not believe in the prevailing understanding of God as defined by the Roman Empire. So today I'm focusing on the monotheistic understanding because that's the one we're most familiar with in our culture. We're not Buddhist, we're not Hindu. We have inherited this particular understanding. Now, I think that no one has likely influenced the thinking of Protestant Christians about the topic of God any more than a man most of you have never heard of. His name is Gordon Kaufman, and he was my professor of theology at Harvard. He taught at Harvard for 30 years. And in addition to his numerous degrees from prestigious universities, he was an ordained minister in the Mennonite church for 50 years. He was a Mennonite. And he wrote at least 13 books, all of them about God. And he trained teachers of theology, and he trained clergy that spread out over this country. The book that I studied when I took theology from Dr. Kaufman was called God, the Problem. And Kaufman's teachings on God start with the biblical notion that God is the creator, and he proposes that we should think of God as creativity. Creativity. God is creativity. Now, you remember what we said last week about how perceptions of reality change when culture gives in to overwhelmingly new scientific information. They reject it for a while. We reject it for a while until we can't do that anymore. We reject it because it messes with too much of our stuff. And the church rejected Copernicus's theory because they'd have to redo everything. But finally, Copernicus won the day, and so there was a new understanding of reality. Now, it's important to get this. Reality doesn't change, but our understanding of reality changes. Okay? This is important when it comes to Gordon Kaufman. Gordon Kaufman began his academic journey in the 1950s. You know what was going on in the 1950s? Our world got turned upside down. Our understanding of where we live got turned upside down by this upstart astronomer named Edwin Hubble. Up until Edwin Hubble's discovery from California, we human beings firmly believed there was one galaxy, the Milky Way. There wasn't anything else. That was it. And Hubble made this discovery that led to these discoveries that not only are we not the only galaxy, now we know there are like 300 billion other galaxies. You can't get your head around it. You cannot conceive of that. And the distance of what we can measure, of just what we with our instruments can measure, is 80 billion light years. Can't get your mind around that either, but that changed everything. Because we needed a God big enough for that. There's a huge cultural shift. We live in this sea of creative energy. You know, when science changes, when physics changes, then everything that's built upon it leading up to the softer sciences, they change as well. And I was taught in graduate school that there's like about a 400-year lag between something that happens in physics and then what really filters down to the general culture. And the illustration I give for this is that we have a printing press, we have the King James Version of the Bible printed, right? And it's 400 years later that we have the Revised Version of the Bible. That was really upsetting to a lot of people if you're old enough at the time to remember that. I love the heady excitement of being at Harvard and watching him work and working with James Fowler. I love the title of his book, God the Problem. God is a Problem. We don't know what we mean when we use the word. But the problem with God goes a lot deeper than I'm even able to say. I've been a counselor or a spiritual teacher for almost half a century now. And over the years, I have seen people, really good people, who really want to live with the marks that I keep mentioning to you in here over and over: peace, love, and joy, and patience. And they have a compelling sense that these things are central to what they want to shape their life around, and they can't find meaning in the dominant conceptions and understandings of their organized religion, except in a few places. In fact, much of what people have found in religion doesn't just fail them, but harms them. Indeed, I'm giving these talks out of an understanding that an entire mode of understanding and talking about God is dying, and something new wants to be born that we don't have yet. There is a story from the Jewish tradition that most of you know. Jacob, in the Hebrew story, he's really a scoundrel of a guy, a trickster, a deceiver, and so forth, and he's going to go try to make peace with his brother. You know the story, right? And so he gets as far as the Jabbok River, and he sent all these things ahead to bribe his brother so that he won't kill him when he sees him. And he goes to sleep, and he has this dream in which he wrestles with this angel. You know the story, right? And when he wakes up from the dream, two things have happened to him. He has a new name, and he's crippled. He's wounded. And he says, truly, God was in this place, and I did not know. Whatever we mean when we use the word God has been here the whole time, and we are not aware. Some may think it heretical to venture into such territory, but I think it's exciting not to dive into it. It seems wrong to me. You've ever fallen in love? You've fallen in love, whether with your partner, or with your baby, with your pet. And when you fall in love, you want to tell the whole world about it. That's the way I feel about this stuff. This what is that we are being brought to, this new understanding because of physics and the way that we are going to go forward, hopefully. In 1995, this guy, who was a hero for many of us at the time, Carl Sagan, he wrote a book. And the book that Sagan wrote was called The Demon Haunted World. And in the book, there is a passage I want to read to you. I remember this in 1995. I have a foreboding of an America in my children or grandchildren's time when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the key manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues, when the people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority, when, clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what is true, we slide almost without noticing back into superstition and darkness. The dumbing down of America is most evident in the slow decay of substantive content in the enormously influential media, the 30-second soundbite now down to 10 seconds or less, lowest common denominator programming, credulous presentations on pseudoscience and superstition, but especially a kind of celebration of ignorance. We call that post-truth society. I think Sagan's foreboding seems more critical to pay attention to now than then. This is why, in my opinion, and all this is just my opinion, you take it for that, it's so important for us to gain clarity about our identity as who we are. Spiritual beings who gain our identity from the creative energy that we call God, that we are part of that process. So spirituality is not merely about prayer or meditation, mystical experiences, or anything ethereal. It's certainly not about right belief. Spirituality is about cultivating right relationships at every scale of reality. One of my contentions is that to do this leads us smack dab into the mysterious, things that are way too big to be contained in religious beliefs. We're too complex for that. Our world is too complex for that. So what we are just on the front edge of learning is that creation, the cosmos, is filled with surprise and possibility, and too much that defies our limited minds and categories. Religion, especially when it becomes fundamentalism, has a way of building a fence around the heart, cutting us off from what we know to be true. I want you to think about it. Humans have been around for only 0.0001% of the Earth's history. And yet the claim of some to know the truth about the mind of God and who God is and who God likes is most stunning. Now, as I said, my primary purpose or goal in this time today is in no way to replicate the work of Karen Armstrong. I just mainly wanted to put on the table the notion that God, it is the idea of God, has a history. To get you to come up with your own answer to the question, what is your character of God? And over the weeks ahead then, to enlarge on the notion of what in Christian theology is called the incarnation. Now, we have been taught or led to believe that the incarnation is strictly limited to Jesus. God was in Christ. But a more scientifically correct way of seeing God as creator is that God is not only in everything, but God is everything. Incarnation names and celebrates the embodiment of God in the whole of creation, celebrating what God creates throughout the 13.7 billion years of evolution and likely beyond that into deep time. After all, God first appeared in the body of the universe and in a vast range of embodied forms long before there were creatures called humans. This puts us on a new evolutionary threshold. in which all kinds of new things are up for reconsideration. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about the patriarchal structures that have housed religion for centuries. There's got to be a more egalitarian discernment on what is the truth. We have been walking like a one-legged person. We have to include everybody at the table. And that's just not the ethos of the culture we live in. Since now we know something of the history of the universe that was not known until, metaphorically speaking, just a few seconds ago, we're in a position of wondering, how was it that we arrived at a place where truth belonged primarily, if not exclusively, to Christians? Our prevailing notions of God, which you find in scriptures of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, are essentially projections of angry patriarchal conquerors. And what they did was take an earlier experience of the sacred and push it back from creation into some heaven above. By doing this, humans have been able to continue unchecked the brutal game of divide and conquer, which is the basis of so much of the destructive work being done in our world. Dermud or Muchu, and if you take the Richard Rohr daily medications, you see him quoted more and more in there. He's a man I mentioned to you. I'll show you another one of his books in a minute. He says, quote, "We have invented a heavenly monstrosity so brutal that God is prepared to sacrifice God's own beloved child to redeem us from the mess that we ourselves created." So, history of God. Until the agricultural revolution, which was about 12,500 years ago, God was mostly thought of and related to in incarnational ways. God was not up there. God was in the water. God was in the fire. God was in the stream. God was in the trees. God was in the animals. God was all around. Great Spirit. In some cultures, like in Hinduism, this took on the form of many gods. Many gods all around. And then came chaos on earth. We don't know all that happened. We know ice sheets came down from Europe. We know the hunting-gathering lifestyle came to an end. People started gathering in communities for safety and for agriculture, and they became tribal. And out of this chaos came the concept of a monotheistic God. Our God is better than your God. And because things were so chaotic on earth, and according to Amuchu, these violent rivalries took place in the sky. So you remember that even in the Hebrew myth about the creation, at the beginning, there's the angels get in a battle in heaven. Rivalries intended in heaven fall to earth, and warring humans take over what the gods were doing. It's an amazing story. This is the origin of original sin, for which humans would have to burn in hell forever if a solution were not found. I said many times, Anselm wrote the most successful bad theology ever written. Not a safe God. So I want to give you one other quote from Ramucci's book. Now this guy, if you read him, you find out that he is a very devoted Christian. This guy's a Catholic. But I'll read you to. Maybe this will tempt you to go with it. Because he has a view of God as here and safe and loving and embracing. Right? Ormucci, one wonders how intelligent human beings could ever have become so gullible and so codependent. For some 5,000 years, we've swallowed these outrageous myths, perpetuating belief systems that have wreaked havoc on people and planet alike. We are just not adult enough to let go of the infantile grip such religiosity holds on us and reclaim a more integrated spirituality within the living womb of creation itself. There, we will encounter the Great Spirit, a far more liberating and empowering incarnation of the true God. That's beautiful. You know, I spent years in here, mostly in front of you, living with Jesus and his teachings. And I can assure you, just like I can tell you about dying, it's perfectly safe. God is perfectly safe. Jesus desired to create a world that was good news for everybody. For the poor and the oppressed, to set the burden and the battered free. What happened to that world? When Jesus taught about the end of the world, he wasn't talking about the Left Behind series. Rather, he was talking about a world that promotes, and at the end of the world that promotes bondage and blindness and oppression. He was talking about the dawning of sight where people can see what is really going on. We live in a world where systems clash against systems more often than not in the name of God and religion. The real war that matters in this world in which we live is the one we wage within ourselves. It's the fight between the current system of values and its control over us and our complicity with it. I think our spiritual and psychological work has developed the courage and the faith to look and see what we have hidden in our hearts that keeps us from living authentically, that keeps us from living with power, that keeps us from living with grace, peace, love, joy, patience. What fears keep us cowering before the world and not daring to rock the boat or question the system? The big sin of the church historically, and this is why the church has started and condoned wars, is that the church has fit the teachings of Jesus into its life rather than fitting its life into the teachings of Jesus. Jesus has been domesticated into someone who fits our agenda. How did we come to believe in the God most people simply unconsciously accept? What is the character of your God? No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this: you carry precious cargo, so watch your step, and I will see you here next week.